Today I'll be presenting the tension between MEV and censorship resistance. So as was mentioned, it's slightly speculative, more speculative than I'm used to. This is an idea that we've been trying to formalize a little, but it's turned out to be quite difficult. So let me take you through an introduction and see what your thoughts are at the end. So for this session, I'd like to frame MEV as an aligning values problem. MEV is the maximum value that some extractor can extract from building the block. And this has some private benefits for this actor. And the Ethereum protocol has some other benefit function, which we call the social benefit. And in principle, the Ethereum protocol aims to maximize this social benefit, but it's very unaware of anything that happens outside of it. So it doesn't know the external state of the world, and it fully relies upon this actor. The extractor is an agent of the protocol. Censorship resistance is one of the core values of the social benefit that Ethereum has. You could see it as either a means to an end. So maybe you want to have censorship resistance to obtain some other properties. For example, being able to have applications that rely on this censorship resistance within real time. Or you could see it as the end goal. So have censorship resistance for the sake of censorship resistance. Whatever way you see it, the ecosystem needs to align the private benefits, which is the MEV that the extractor can extract, with the social benefits, which is what we as an Ethereum ecosystem want the Ethereum protocol to do. So here are some observations on censorship, without any normative statements, I'd say. So there are three sorts of censorship that we see happening, possibly, is economic censorship. So maybe some extractor wants to censor a transaction because it can get more value by doing so. An example is multi-block MEV that we've seen earlier today, or the leading example that I wanted to use here is if someone has some loan, for example, on Aave, and it might get liquidated soon, they want to send a transaction in order to heal their loan, but the extractor censors this transaction because it wants the loan to go bad in order so that it can extract some MEV from it. Then there's accidental censorship, and this may seem very weird. How is a transaction ever accidentally censored? But it turns out that this is actually something that we observe right now. So there are many, many messages floating around in a mempool, and sometimes builders just simply miss transactions for whatever reason that is. And if we take it to the limit, builders in principle want to keep their block as lightweight as possible. So any transaction takes up bandwidth, and especially some transactions that are very, very heavy, for example, blobs take up a lot of bandwidth. If you take up more bandwidth, it means that your block takes more time to send to the other nodes, meaning that you have to send it earlier, meaning that you can't delay your block submission as well as you could if you were to play optimal timing games. So potentially a builder is censoring transactions because it thinks that it may get more value if it doesn't include this transaction, but includes a transaction in the future. And this is timing games. Taking it to the limit, a builder may actually miss its slot, which means that no transactions in this slot end up on chain. And this is obviously censorship. And then there's regulatory censorship, which is what most people are probably familiar with, is there's some government that says these sorts of transactions cannot be included by this actor, and where the actor is the extractor, who's an agent of the Ethereum protocol, but apparently also has other constraints enforced upon it. So given that we observe these sorts of censorship, or at least that we know that these theoretically exist, the conclusion should be that the values are currently not aligned. Aligning private and social values is something that economists have been doing for ages, so there's a lot that we know about it. But within Ethereum, we are relatively constrained in what we can do. For example, giving rewards for it is difficult because it means that we have to issue tokens. And if you issue tokens, it means that possibly there is some collusion that could benefit from this. So the way that we've been doing it is analogous to regulation, kind of. And this is our value aligning design philosophy. We do so by creating rules that constrain how the actor can act within a certain slot. So for the framing of this talk, we'll use the state transition function as how MEV is extracted. So gamma is a state transition function. It's publicly known. The extractor cannot alter it. And what it says is which state transitions are valid and which are not. So for example, you can't put an invalid transaction in a state transition function and obtain a valid state transition. S here is the state of the previous block, which is also publicly known. And T is an ordered list of transactions that the extractor inserts into the state transition function to obtain some S prime, which is the new state. The extractor, in principle, has full control over this T. And this is the key part where we'll try to align values by getting more information about T and then making some opinionated choice on what T should be. So if we map the states that you could enter into, which is very high dimensional, it contains all of the accounts and all of the balances into a two-dimensional plane with just private benefits and social benefits, you may see that S star, which would be the optimal solution that some extractor employs, should rank very high on private benefits. This is clear because this is the objective function of the extractor. There's no objective to maximize social benefits in principle, but perhaps there is some social benefits. Here it's relatively low, but it could be higher. The values don't necessarily have to be unaligned. The key problem here, though, is that Ethereum doesn't know what the social benefit is and which social benefits are possible. This is because Ethereum has no knowledge about the external state of the world except for the T that was inputted by this extractor. And since this extractor doesn't have the same values, it can't really know what the social benefits are. So on a high level, the idea of the current ways to increase censorship resistance is by, first of all, making this more legible. So you could think of, for example, having multiple inputs into T and not necessarily acting upon it, just making it more legible in the first place. So the red part here is some state transitions that are very undesirable from the social benefit point of view. The orange part is maybe more desirable, the green part is good, and the dark green part is what Ethereum views as the best. And this slide is supposed to show that making things legible doesn't always mean that it's perfect. You can see that the dark green part, for example, has the same social benefit as some parts above and under it. Yet Ethereum, the protocol, might think that these are better, purely because it's constrained in the knowledge that it has about the external world. One way that we then want to try to align these values is by imposing some constraints. So you could think as Ethereum saying, okay, we've seen now some of these possible states of the world, and we for sure do not want you to go into this red and this orange area, and maybe we're not so careful and we cut off some of the green area as well. It's very hard to make constraints that are binding at the exact points that we want and achieve the right goals. And you can see as well that in this very stylized example, I must say, there's a straight line. It's difficult to make constraints that are more bounded around, for example, circles or that have more nuances because Ethereum has to remain very neutral. So it can only cut off parts of the possible states that are obviously bad, and cutting off parts of the state that are potentially good in some future would be bad for neutrality. So now I'll go through some case studies. The first one is inclusion lists. We have an ERP out for Fossil, which is ERP 7805, which is our inclusion list design. The high-level design philosophy behind inclusion lists is that we allow the most decentralized sets of participants to have some input into centralized block construction. And the idea is that the inclusionist shouldn't be able to attract any MEV. So we do this because it kind of aligns the private benefits and the social benefits of the inclusionist creator and of the Ethereum protocol. If the inclusionist creator were able to attract MEV, then it would probably do so. And we observe that MEV leads to some centralization and makes it difficult to ensure that we don't have these sorts of economic, accidental, or regulatory censorship. So the goal of inclusion list is to increase the chain neutrality, and we do this by having some list of transactions that constrains how the execution payload is created. And this gets us at the notion of uncrowdability, which is one of the main points of the talk. Uncrowdability is something that we're trying to explore more, and its informal definition would be that the inclusion list creates more value for the inclusionist creator if used as intended. It's very related to incentive compatibility, but incentive compatibility assumes that you know exactly what point you want to go to. And the Ethereum protocol, again, has very limited knowledge of the world, and it wants to be very neutral, so it may prefer to be neutral over getting perfect incentive compatibility. It just doesn't want some very obviously dominated things to happen. For example, using the inclusion list for MEV extraction, and maybe less obviously so, using it for pre-confirmations, which is that the inclusionist creator tells someone, okay, if you're in my inclusion list, you're guaranteed to be in the block, and you should pay me some fee for this. We don't want this to happen because we believe that if these sorts of markets pop up, then we might go into a similar setting as the MEV boost-like markets that we see for block production, which would lead to centralization and defeat the goals of censorship resistance. So the idea is that inclusion lists must be minimally invasive such that the intended constraints are achieved. Otherwise, the private benefits of inclusion lists may differ from the social benefits, and if the private benefits of different inclusionist creators differ a lot, then it will lead to centralization with the MEV boost-like markets. And a nice example here in my mind is unconditional versus conditional inclusionist. Unconditional inclusionist states that if all transactions from the inclusion list must be included in the block, regardless of whether the block is full. And conditional inclusion list states that all transactions must be included unless the block is full. You may intuitively think that unconditional inclusion list gives you better inclusion guarantees because any transaction in the inclusion list must be included within the block. But actually, uncrowdability gets at an earlier notion of what goes into the inclusion list. So if you make inclusion lists unconditional, meaning that they have better inclusion guarantees, and for example, to take the most extreme example, you could say that this inclusion list must be included at the top of the next block. Because these transactions were seen earlier, perhaps this is some notion of fairness. Whatever way, you could make this argument that inclusion list transactions should be included at the top of the block. And this would mean that creating the inclusion list now becomes very valuable. And now there will be a market for outsourcing this inclusion list creation, which is perhaps going to exactly the same person as the one that constructed the block. And so we explicitly want to prevent this by making the inclusion list conditional. So I would say that the constraint is maybe more relaxed within conditional, but the way that the constraint is created is more likely to gain what we intended as a protocol to achieve. If that makes sense. And then the second case study would be multiple concurrent block producers, which is a whole topic these days. The basic idea is that there are multiple block producers producing subblocks simultaneously instead of inclusion list, where the inclusion list is created sometime before. And I would actually argue that this sometime before is a feature and not a bug, because precisely the argument that I'll show here is that multiple concurrent block producers relies upon some sophisticated parties, whereas inclusion list does not foster the same environment. So the goal of multiple concurrent block producers would be to prevent economic censorship. The idea is that if we prevent transactions that are censored for some adverse selection reason, so transactions that need to be very timely, where there's, for example, like high frequency trading types of ideas, then we can achieve a new set of applications that we haven't been able to realize today. An example of multiple concurrent block producers is Meckenstein, which is the proposal from Barnaby and Mike, which means that one person creates a top of block and the other person creates the rest of block. And another example is Braid, which is proposed by Maciejewski and co., which is a deterministic merger of K chains, where each payload is merged deterministically according to some predefined ordering rule. How this scores on the uncrowdability table is very speculative, I say, because we don't know that much about multiple concurrent block producers yet. But to me, it sounds clear that MCBP, since it's specifically there for the gain in censorship resistance for transactions that are very MEV sensitive, so these are the high frequency trading transactions that may suffer adverse selection if they were put into the inclusion list, where it takes a little bit of time for them to get included, it would allow any block producer to extract MEV equally well. This is basically one of the design goals of multiple concurrent block producers. This means that these partials blocks are a vehicle for MEV, and you can't expect a large, unsophisticated, and geographically decentralized set of participants to have competitive private valuations for these property rights of making these partial blocks that carry MEV. Similar to how we see now in MEV Boost that there are only 2 builders who are very good at this. There are returns to skill of being a block producer in MCBP, which means that my marginal benefits of gaining an extra seat in these K parallel chains increases with the amount of seats that I already have. And there are returns to sophistication, so it's not easy to build these blocks. Even when block building is constrained, it doesn't mean that block building is simple. There are definitely still returns to sophistication, and there are barriers to entry, which we now currently know mainly in the form of private order flow. So that's why multiple concurrent block producers, in my mind, depends on a tester-proposer separation. And multiple concurrent block producers is very crowdable, so you can't expect decentralized sets of participants who are unsophisticated and willing to enable, I guess, to contribute to censorship resistance to build partial blocks. So we need to ensure that its creators are not also the testers, because that would then centralize the tester set. If you put some centralizing force on a decentralized set of participants, then the decentralized set of participants will become centralized, and it's not that magically the centralized property becomes gets some decentralization properties. So that's why a tester-proposer unlocks some new block construction pipelines that are currently not possible. You could, for example, allocate the attesting rights to a set of attesters and allocate building rights to a set of builders separately. So what are some of the consequences of this uncrowdability notion? Well, this is, I think, a very fun part to explore. And one thing that I've been thinking about a bit is applications consuming consensus information. So now assume that we have this uncrowdable inclusion list, meaning that it's very unlikely that it will contain MEV transactions since it's specifically designed to not be a vehicle over MEV. It's very unlikely to include arbitrage transactions, therefore. So an application who may see this may treat transactions that came via the inclusion list differently from transactions that came in via the main block. It may do so because it's more confident that transactions from the inclusion list are uninformed and won't take their liquidity. In general, if you're designing a trading mechanism, it's important to distinguish between those who are very well informed, arbitrageurs, and those who are not, because trading between two parties is in general zero sum, especially if it's arbitrage. So if an arbitrageur is making money, it's at the cost of some other person in the static world vision. So what you could possibly do is you could use an asymmetric speed bump, which is something that's been developed within traditional finance. And what it does is it speed bumps certain transactions and it doesn't speed bump others. So the inclusion list has a natural speed bump. And again, I think this is a feature and not a bug. So what you may say is the inclusion list transactions, they are able to take liquidity, whereas the transactions from the block, they're able to provide liquidity. Taking liquidity is the arbitrage path, where providing liquidity is not the arbitrage path unless you look at, for example, just-in-time liquidity. But you could set up the trading rules so that you aim specifically for this, meaning that liquidity providers would face less adverse selection, meaning that there would be more liquidity, lower trading costs for users. Seemingly, though, it seems to be a bit of a paradox. It's if the exchange believes that the inclusion list is uncrowdable, then it's suddenly very valuable to make the inclusion list because now your transactions are treated differently. So then maybe inclusion list becomes crowdable again. But then if the inclusion list is crowdable, the exchange thinks, okay, well, this is not so valuable anymore, I won't act upon it. So it seems to be kind of like the Spider-Man meme, you know, where you're pointing towards each other and expecting the other person to do something or to remain static. I would say, though, that this is not a paradox because the application plays a sequential game and not a simultaneous game. The application must commit without regret to its strategy of handling transactions. You can't imagine an exchange saying, okay, if you send me your transaction, I have no clue what I'll do with it. Maybe I'll do this, maybe I'll do that. So you need some commitments of how the exchange rules are set up. And so the exchange will only commit to using such an asymmetric speed bump if it believes that the inclusion list would still be uncrowdable after its commitment. So it must commit without regret. So there shouldn't be a paradox. Even when applications specifically use uncrowdable inclusion lists, we can still have uncrowdable inclusion lists. So some of the statements that I'd like to leave off with is that if censorship-resistant gadgets are uncrowdable, then its creators can be decentralized. So if there's no other use case that's better than using the censorship-resistant gadget, specifically what it's designed, then you may ask some of the decentralized participants to create this because it won't centralize the set further. If the censorship-resistant gadget is crowdable, then its creators will be centralized. This is not a centralization is not a feature of market mechanism, although market mechanisms can change it a little. It's mostly a feature of the intrinsic property rights. It doesn't matter how you allocate, for example, building rights, especially within the Ethereum protocol, because there can be secondary markets. It's the fact that building rights are inherently sophisticated and there are inherently barriers to entry. So it's not about proposer-builder separation, it's about the building rights. And finally, uncrowdable censorship-resistant gadgets seem stable. So potentially there's a whole new set of applications that we can unlock if applications can consume consensus layer information. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed and it sparked some conversation. And I'd be happy to take any questions. So does inclusionist with an inclusionist committee members making economic censorship n times more expensive? This is a property that's not currently in Fossil. Fossil relies on boosting the signal of solo stakers. Fossils are ERP, so we made this decision because putting this property that you get an inclusionist committee makes it n times more expensive, adds protocol complexity. We don't think it's warranted at this point because we see a revealed preference of people willing and able to make, to even take an economic penalty to provide censorship resistance. Getting this property though is an easy extension to Fossil. So if it's necessary, we could implement it easily.
Yeah, just scan the QR code for anyone who wants to ask any questions and it'll show up. Yeah, we have a second question, which I'm going to read out for the audience joining online. How do you achieve uncrowdability of IL? Is that a property enforced by the spec or achieved through the selection of IL creators? How to select who creates the IL?
Yeah, so the design philosophy behind inclusionist is that you select the most decentralized sets of participants to have input into centralized block construction. So uncrowdability is not achieved by the selection because this is, again, it's achieved not by the market mechanism, but it's achieved by the inherent property rights of creating this inclusion list. And so what we do is we make the minimally invasive way that the inclusion list could be structured in order to still attain the censorship resistance properties that we're looking at. So specifically in our ERP, there are 3 seconds between that the inclusion list last can be committed to and the block produced. So it's difficult to include any transactions like arbitrage because these would be relevant within the 3 seconds, and you may face adverse selection if you were to do so. Secondly, there are multiple inclusionist proposers, so there's not one inclusionist proposer who has unilateral power over inclusion, ordering, or exclusion, which is the general definition of MEV. There's no private order flow possible because inclusionists are broadcasted publicly, and they are only enforced if they are broadcasted publicly. So you can't get any private transactions into the block, and most importantly, inclusionists don't have any ordering rights. So an inclusion list is just a set of transactions, inclusion sets, I guess, and it doesn't say anything about the ordering within the block, meaning that there's no MEV to be extracted. It's the minimally invasive inclusion list possible.
The next question is, do you think that if we don't incentive ILs with some part of the fees, it might lead to a scenario where everyone creates empty ILs?
So I don't think this is likely. Why I don't think this is likely is in Fossil we select 16 validators. So if we ran some numbers and conservative estimate of solo stakers is 6%, which means that in 63% of slots there's at least one solo staker. We currently see that solo stakers and others are willing to take some economic penalty to contribute to censorship resistance. We see people locally building blocks, and we see people setting a min bid within MEV boost, meaning that if the MEV boost revenue is lower than some threshold, I'll just build my block myself. So you see here an economic penalty. Inclusionists don't impose any economic penalty, but they also don't gain you anything. Given that people are willing to take an economic penalty and inclusionists basically give you 0, we expect at least some people willing to participate. If only one of the 16 is willing to participate, we already get these censorship resistance properties that we're looking at.
How can IL be unconditional in the presence of the block gas limit?
Yeah, so this is, I think, just a semantics question. Unconditional, unconditional basically means that the transactions have to be included regardless of whether the block is full or not. You could make some separated gas for it, which was proposed in the ERP 7547, which is Mike's inclusionist ERP, where there's just a dedicated amount of gas for the inclusionist. And this usually comes with somewhere in block property. So potentially you could put it at the bottom of the block. You could also say, which is more complicated for the builder, but the transactions just have to be in the block. I don't care where, they must be in there. This would force the builder to reconstruct the block more often, and it would be slightly more complicated. In principle, ILs with unconditional and block gas limits are not mutually exclusive because you up the block gas limit to accompany the unconditional IL.
If IL selection does not take balance into account, could Fossil make the max EB increase less effective?
So actually, this makes it more effective. If you don't take the balance into account, you select more people who have lower balance. You probably want to select more people who have lower balance for censorship resistance because they're more likely to be unsophisticated, maybe geographically diverse. You probably don't want to select Coinbase, even though they might contribute to the economic and the accidental censorship. So in my mind, not taking balance into account makes Fossil a lot more effective, actually.
Wow, that was really good talk and really detailed. Give a round